Hello. As we have seen in the first video on feminist criticism within this course on critical theory, the first feminist wave, and also initially the second feminist wave, were slow in attending to a great number of women who did not come from privileged white backgrounds. After the Second World War, the Holocaust, the bombing of Hiroshima, or the post-war period and the Cold War, a number of liberating dynamics gained place, such as those that sponsored the independence of the former colonies, in addition to pro-human rights movement. But many Black, colonial and post-colonial, as well as lesbian women writers, were still ignored. These early waves assumed the specific concerns of white, middle and upper-class heterosexual women writers. Against this generalizing force, various versions of feminist and anti-essentialism emerged in the late 1970s and early 1980s and prepared the grounds for the third feminist wave, which will attend to the demands of marginal groups such as homosexuals and racial minorities.
I'm meant to propose that sex is a political category the way class is or race, and that one sex has dominated the life of the other sex all through recorded history, the whole patriarchal period, which is under the system, and a patriarchy is a kind of government. Under that, all power of all institutions is in male hands, and females are second-class citizens and psychologically oppressed and kept out of all office of importance and significance in a culture and so on. And the world as we know it, it's a man's world.
The different protest movements that emerged in the 70s and 80s had in common the revision of power schemes and traditional hegemonic patterns and the demands for the rights of silenced groups. Postmodern theorizing, with its defense of decentralization of power, helped to transform, if not to dissolve, the last certainties that defined social structures, people's identities, and even the debate about the feminine. While new options opened up for women thanks to legal, economic, social, political, and educational changes, social problems like child abuse, sexual and other forms of violence towards women and children were not mitigated. One of the consequences of the disappearance of hierarchical categories was the incorporation of marginal and silenced group discourses and their representation in art and literature with unprecedented creative force. In addition to this discursive heterogeneity, the dividing lines between disciplines, artistic and literary genres, also disintegrated. Feminist vindication was no longer focused towards the definition of the feminine, but to vindicate the multiplicity of femininities, allowing differences among women themselves derived from belonging to ethnic, racial, cultural, social, or sexual female subcultures. Gradually, the key word became intersectionality. Intersectionality seeks to understand how aspects of a person's social and political identity, gender, race, class, sexuality, ability, etc., combine to create diverse modes of discrimination. Although some of the traits of this emerging third feminist wave are evident in the late 70s and 80s, they became more pronounced in the 1990s, highlighting the differences between women, differences of class, race, nationality, temporality, and targeting the universal and the natural as ideological patriarchal constructs that serve to reify negative definitions of women. On your screen you have a graph showing the fundamental aspects that influenced feminist criticism in the 70s and 80s. This phase coincided with the further culturalization of the feminine and a new concern that not all women are oppressed in the same way. There are women who have power over other women, for example, due to class inequalities, or women who have more power than some men, for example, in racist societies. Such contradictions also emanated from imagining power as a localable entity external to subjects. That is, from supposing that ideology and its forms of media representation can be contemplated as a power structure. These orientations arose in the intellectual climate of May 1968, when a series of student protests against capitalism, consumerism, and imperialism shook the French capital. The protests involved over 500 protesters, and the political leaders feared civil war or revolution. At the end of May 1968, François Mitterrand of the Socialist Left declared that the people were ready to form a new government, and President Charles de Gaulle called for parliamentary elections. The protests ceased, but the period was considered a socio-cultural turning point. It meant the beginning of a new era of new social movements. In this context, the claims of the left-wing scholars such as Louis Althusser or Michel Foucault, and please refer to our video on Marxist criticism, part 2, were also influential in this second feminist wave. They showed that although power follows hierarchical structures, these are not distributed in the same way in all societies because of the impact of ideology and the structures of power, and that these differences should be taken into account. Althusser's personal story is paradoxically the very proof of how ideological apparatus works. Discover it in the following couple of video cuts.
Senti, tu sostenevi che gli apparati ideologici di Stato fossero delle strutture molto importanti del dominio di una classe.
Lo penso,
no?
sempre.
Ecco. Ora...
dico di Stato, su questo problema, sai,
sì.
Tutti hanno adoperato questo termine apparato ideologico, no? Non sapevo che Gramsci usava del termine apparato egemonico.
Sì.
Va bene, la stessa parola, salvo che lo Stato sparisce. Io ci tengo a che lo Stato ci sia dentro, perché è la cosa più importante di tutto. Sono apparati ideologici di Stato.
Anche se sono
dipende
privati.
Naturalmente dalla definizione che tu dai dello Stato, capisci? Tu devi dare un'altra definizione dello Stato, non tenerci alla definizione classica che Marx ne ha dato, perché Marx nello Stato non capiva niente dello Stato, Marx non ha capito niente. Sì, ha capito che era uno strumento a disposizione della classe dominante, sì, questo è giusto, ma sul funzionamento dello Stato, sullo spazio dello Stato non ha capito niente.
Per esempio anche Gramsci parlava, non so, dei giornali e diceva pubblici o privati che siano, sono comunque apparati di Stato, no? Apparati
no, non ha mai parlato di Stato.
Non di Stato, però
egemonico.
Apparati egemonici,
sì,
anche se privati, non necessariamente pubblici.
Sì, giusto, l'ho detto anch'io.
Ma ora gli apparati della riproduzione, no? Diciamo così, dei rapporti di produzione, voglio dire, non sono però soltanto i mezzi di comunicazione di massa, i partiti, i sindacati, la famiglia, anche le fabbriche per esempio riproducono,
naturalmente.
I rapporti sociali, con la gerarchia,
giusto.
La carriera.
Non ne ho parlato, ma è giusto la tua obiezione, è giusto?
Avril 1980. Le philosophe Louis Althusser donne une interview pour la RAI. C'est la première fois qu'il accepte d'être filmé. L'équipe de la télévision italienne l'interroge sur Marx, le communisme, tous les thèmes qui ont fait de lui l'une des références intellectuelles de la période révolutionnaire qui s'achève. La crise du communisme est déjà là. L'influence d'Althusser est sur le déclin. Quelques mois après le tournage de cet entretien, il étrangle et tue sa femme au cours d'une crise de démence. Il achève de disparaître complètement. 1948. Louis Althusser a 30 ans. Il fait la connaissance d'Hélène Légotien-Rittmann. Hélène a appartenu à la résistance et au Parti communiste français qui vient de l'exclure. C'est elle, pourtant, qui pousse Althusser à s'inscrire au parti. Les communistes acceptent Althusser, mais lui demandent aussitôt de quitter Hélène. Louis Althusser ne quittera ni Hélène, ni le Parti communiste français.
As you have seen in the previous videos and in Geraldine Finn's words, we cannot afford to continue to separate the intellectual in a man from the emotional, from the depression, from the ideas, or the political from the personal, the commitment to class struggle, or from the stormy marriage, the dead wife. Neither Althusser, France, nor the world's intellectuals and revolutionaries will acknowledge patriarchy as the powerful, pervasive, and pernicious ideological state apparatus which it is. At the same time, none of them escape its effects. Lacan's publication of Écrits in 1966, his writings, if we translate it to English, contributed to the demystification of the Cartesian notion of the subject. Anthropological, phenomenological, linguistic, or existential analysis during the 1960s also contributed to this debate. The Marxist influence showed how ideological apparatuses control public opinion, as in the case of Althusser's personal story. Feminists influenced by these developments, and by Michel Foucault, rejected the universality of the feminine, emphasizing its subject construction in discourse, contemplating the notion of discourse both as linguistic expression and as social practice in a given place and time, and under given ideological frames, or in Foucault's words, episteme.
Le pouvoir, c'est des relations. Le pouvoir, ce n'est pas une chose. C'est une relation entre deux individus, et une relation qui est telle que l'un peut conduire la conduite d'un autre, ou déterminer la conduite d'un autre, la déterminer volontairement en fonction d'un certain nombre d'objectifs qui sont les siens. Autrement dit, quand on regarde ce qu'est le pouvoir, c'est l'exercice de quelque chose qu'on peut appeler le gouvernement, au sens très large.
Objections were also raised, particularly coming from French Algerian philosopher of language Jacques Derrida, regarding the fact that words and concepts are always defined in terms of other concepts, in a chain of meaning only valid within the system of language, a given system of language. The order in which one word or concept depends on each other follows what Foucault had already termed as the order of knowledge, and it generally established binary pairs, which are the most simple forms of categorization and relation, and include things like rational versus irrational, masculine versus feminine, experience versus theory, individual and social, or white and black. Derrida's practice of deconstruction helped to dig into the text and bring out meanings that subvert or contradict what the author appears to be saying. In other words, deconstruction shows that one term out of the binary opposition is privileged, while the other is dependent. This relationship of power might mean the exclusion and marginality of the second term, which in reality refers to a particular group of people. So this means that certain elements within sign systems of signification and representation, that is, semiotic systems, are being marginalized or even excluded. So for Derrida, discourse is defined as the staging of power structures, a play of signs and signifiers within the system of signification. He calls this play différence. Ultimately, the play makes it impossible to fix meaning because every term, word, or concept in the system, including truth, it's in relative relation to all the other terms.
You're very well known in the States for deconstruction. Can you talk a little bit about the origin of that idea?
Avant d'essayer de répondre à cette question, je voudrais faire une remarque préliminaire sur le caractère totalement artificielle de cette situation. Je ne sais pas qui regardera ce que nous sommes en train de filmer ou d'enregistrer, mais je voudrais souligner, au lieu de les effacer, ces conditions techniques. Ne pas feindre la naturalité là où elle n'existe pas. J'ai déjà commencé à répondre à votre question sur la déconstruction, parce qu'un des gestes de la déconstruction consiste en particulier à ne pas naturaliser, à ne pas faire comme si ce qui n'est pas naturel était naturel, comme si ce qui est conditionné par l'histoire, par la technique, par l'institution, par la société, était une donnée naturelle.
The very condition of a deconstruction may be at work in the work, within the system to be deconstructed. It may already be located there, already at work, not at the center, but in an eccentric center, in a corner whose eccentricity assures the solid concentration of the system, participating in the construction of what it, at the same time, threatens to deconstruct. One might then be inclined to reach this conclusion. Deconstruction is not an operation that supervenes afterwards, from the outside, one fine day. It is always already at work in the work. Since the disruptive force of deconstruction is always already contained within the very architecture of the work, all one would finally have to do to be able to deconstruct, given this always already, is to do memory work. Yet since I want neither to accept or to reject a conclusion formulated in precisely these terms, let us leave this question suspended for the moment.
So several disciplines begin to point out that language is not a naive code, although it may seem so, and that it encodes a specific perceptual framework, that of the dominant group. Also, insights coming from psychology and psychoanalysis at the time showed that subjectivity is itself an effect of language, reflecting and perpetuating all kinds of inequalities, racial, social, sexual, and so on. Most critics in this second wave of feminism that began in the 1960s defended the existence of a female discourse, arguing that if women, due to the patriarchal context in which they lived, experienced reality differently from men, it was also logical to think that when it came to giving shape to that reality through words, they would do this differently. However, other differences, such as those based on a specific context, social, racial, and so on, were not explored sufficiently in the 60s. So the problem arose in feminist discourse and in other discourses of minorities and marginal cultures and subcultures inserted within the framework of a central culture, whether the language of the dominant culture, in this case white feminism, was adequate to express the experiences and reality of all the other groups, for example, Black women, Asian women, migrant women, etc. So using the discourse of the dominant group became a political act, which meant perpetuating marginalization. Thus, it became necessary to transform discourse, subverting it in some way, so that it could express the perceptual differences among the diverse women groups. And after the 1990s, this inquiry into the differences extended to aspects, including their limited social roles, the codes of action, for example, filters with when selecting words that might incorporate a male-dominant criteria, in what became the theory of performativity that Judith Butler developed and that we shall explore later in this video. With regards to feminist linguistic studies those years, differences were detected in women's speech related to phonological levels, for example, different intonation schemes, and for women seem to show preference for emphatic stress, or in vocabulary, the greater use of certain types of adjectives, such as those describing colors, and vocabulary related to the feel of women. Also grammatical differences, for example, a tendency to prefer courtesy forms, and in dialogue interaction with cooperative and conversational styles. There were also differences in written language, and in general, it was understood that the dominant discourse, in this case the masculine one, tended to use linearity, logic, based on reason, argumentation, and theory in order to lead to final conclusions. However, the discourse of the silence culture, in this case the feminine, was more associative, non-linear, and non-authoritarian. A field of discourse differentiation in the stylistics aspects consisted in the use of subversive strategies, contrary to dominant literary practices, that defended different perspectives of reality for women. And feminine discourse was shown to present a series of stylistic devices that deviated from the norm and signal an opposition to masculine perspectives of reality. The strategies are multiple. For example, as we have mentioned, narration breaks the linear plot and the logical and chronological sequences, leading to unexpected and open forms of organization. And these are very evident, for example, in modernist women writers. And there were also detected differences in point of view, with no defined focus, no clear authority in judgments and conclusions. And these are some of the aspects that regarding the formal considerations of language. The most representative authors of this approach to the study of variations in feminine discourse from the point of view of psychoanalytical theory, philosophy of language, are the French feminists Julik Receiver, Hélène Cixous, and the Belge Luz Irigaray. In many respects, the intellectual relationship between Julik Receiver, Foucault, Jacques Lacan, Jacques Derrida, and several other well-known French theories such as Roland Barthes, Gilles Deleuze, began through their association to a French scholarly journal called Tel Quel, which had been established in 1960 by a young novelist, Philippe Sauger, who later became Christeva's husband. The journal had a clear new left inclination and published a wide range of international avant-garde works, such as those by Virginia Woolf and James Joyce, to name only two English-speaking authors. Julia Kristeva was born in Sliven, Bulgaria in 1941. Her parents worked for the Orthodox Church and moved to the capital Sofia in 1945, when the Yalta Treaty made Bulgaria a Soviet satellite state. Kristeva attended a French nursery school and later the Alliance Française, and in 1965, when President Charles de Gaulle offered a scholarship to French-speaking East Europeans, she received a fellowship to do doctoral research and moved to Paris when she was only 24. There, through some contacts, she quickly got to know Roland Barthes, the poet Louis Aragon, and philosopher Lucien Goldman, and she became involved with the Tel Quel group. In 1967, she married Philippe Sauger, editor of the Tel Quel journal, for visa reasons. And by 1967, her articles were already appearing in prestigious journals. She had barely heard of Freud before she arrived in Paris, and she was impressed by Lacan's legendary seminars, incorporating the insights of psychoanalysis into her own doctoral research, which was published in 1974. That year, Kristeva, Roland Barthes, and other members of the Tel Quel group visited China. In the late 60s, the journal line had shifted from communism to Chinese Maoism. Kristeva has become one of the most influential feminist thinkers, and her work covers semiotics, philosophy, psychoanalysis, and anthropology. The rumors that surfaced a couple of years ago about her spying for the Bulgarian Secret Service started in France in the mid-60s. Indeed, in 2018, some newspapers in the United States, like the New York Times or the New Yorker, published news regarding her hypothetical involvement as an infiltrated Bulgarian secret agent during the Cold War. Her friend and feminist colleague, Alice Jardin, author of Genesis, has published the first authorized biography of Kristeva in 2020, entitled At the Risk of Thinking. Jardin met Kristeva in 1967 when she was 25 and a graduate in French at Columbia in New York. Kristeva has called the Sabina files an aggravated form of surveillance, and she has explained that she passed only minor informational details because her family was under threat. To put it bluntly, I speak in French and about literature because of Yalta. I mean that because of Yalta, I was obliged to marry in order to have a French passport and to work in France. Moreover, because of Yalta, I wanted to marry the violence that has tormented me ever since and has dissolved identity and selves, coveted recognition and haunted me, my nights and my tranquility, caused hatred, in short, has racked me to death. Consequently, as you may have noticed, I have no I anymore, no imaginary, if you wish. Everything escapes or comes together in theory or politics or activism. Some months later, the State Dossier Commission began publishing online documents on her activity as an informant of the former Committee for State Security. Kristeva has continued to vigorously deny this. The file can be accessed at the Sophia Globe website.
Well, you were one of the editors and major contributors to Tel Quel, which was an avant-garde literary journal, but literary and political journal. That journal had a leading role in the social upheavals and political upheavals of 1960s Paris. Do you see that there is a place on today's cultural landscape, either in France or in the United States, for an intellectually serious, politically engaged literary magazine?
Tel Quel was an important magazine because of a particular period in Europe between the end of the 60s, around 68, and I'll say maybe beginning of the 90s, where Marxism and Freudism as, I'll say, critical deconstructions of Western thought were audible, were capable to be widespread in the intellectual circles, and even through television, not only in the university, but even through television. I'm speaking about a particular show, de Bernard Pivot, which is a presenter on the television. Once a week, there was a show about 8 o'clock in the evening with intellectuals speaking about their own works, which is quite rare.
Kristeva received an Eastern Bloc education and had a solid background in Marxist theory. She spoke fluent Russian, which enabled her to acquire first-hand knowledge of the Prague School of Linguistics, especially the work of Roman Jakobson, Russian formalism, and the influential work of Soviet theorist Mikhail Bakhtin. Kristeva was instrumental in translating and introducing some of these thinkers to the Western world, particularly Bakhtin. In her work, Problème de la structuration du texte, which was translated as Word, Dialogue, and the Novel, Kristeva presented her concept of intertextuality, built upon Bakhtin's notion of polyphonic utterances. The act of reading-writing became the transformative reorganization of a given sociocultural intertextual work. Kristeva defined intertextuality as denoting a transposition of one or several sign systems into another or others, And she borrowed the term transposition from Freudian psychoanalysis and using it not only to point out that texts echo each other, but also the way in which discourses or sign systems are transposed in one kind of discourse and overlaid with meanings from another kind of discourse, meaning different forms of semiotic articulation. Both Bakhtin and Kristeva subscribe to the view that texts are constructed out of the larger sociocultural textuality, and hence they cannot be separated from that context, as some formalists and new critics desire. Furthermore, texts are embedded in ideological structures expressed through discourse. Kristeva's early work on semiotics culminated in her doctoral dissertation, published in French in 1974 and translated in English as Revolution in Poetic Language some years later, and also in her other volume, Desire in Language, a Semiotic Approach to Literature and Art. Kristeva's knowledge of formalism and structuralism shaped her early views on language and representation. As a semiotician, she believed that myths and rituals were also sign systems and that these were never static. One of Kristeva's most important contributions is that signification is composed of two elements, the symbolic and the semiotic, the latter being distinct from the discipline of semiology founded by Ferdinand de Saussure. Instead, Harvard professor of logic and pragmatism Charles Sandor Peirce had formulated the possibility of pre-linguistic signs, such as indexes and icons, that, unlike symbolic language, which is abstract and arbitrary, are ruled by norms of hegemonic group, held points of similarity with what they referred to. So indexes are also called pointers, and they find their early expression in pointing gestures, including eye contact, smiles, and so on. And icons include drawings, maps, charts, diagrams, and images in general. So the semiotic is closely related to that infantile pre-Oedipal referred to in the works of Freud, Otto Rank, or Melanie Klein, as well as in Jacques Lacan's pre-mirror stage. It belongs to what Lacan would call the imaginary, instinctual, emotional, and pre-symbolic. That is, pre the acquisition of language that, according to Lacan, comes with the entry into the symbolic and with the law of the father. For Julik Receiver, the force which disrupts the symbolic is the semiotic, which has its origin in the infant drives before its entry into language and the institution of sexual difference. For Kristeva, the semiotic is thus an undifferentiated chora, and she uses the term borrowed from Greek philosopher Plato to describe a sort of complex matrix made up of body rhythms and sounds lacking structure or fixed meaning. And in this way, the early Kristeva was interested in the semiotic, pre-linguistic murmuration, in gestures, and other kinds of signs coming from infancy and the world of dreams, as well as unconscious poetic forms that appear in art and, for example, are evident in the avant-gardes of the 20th century. In Revolution in Poetic Language from 1974 and Polylogue in 1977, Kristeva theorizes the constitution of the subject by distinguishing between the semiotic and symbolic modalities in the signifying process. These modalities are relatively exclusive, but necessarily dialectical. And the distinction is established through a combination of concepts drawn from Plato, psychoanalysis, phenomenology, and linguistic theories. According to Kristeva, semiotic processes predate the symbolic ones and are instinctual and maternal. They are unregulated, but they are ordered according to biological and social constraints, as well as by drives organized around the mother's body. She questions Freudian and Lacanian premises in psychoanalysis that place the primary meaning-making process within the realm of patriarchy and the law of the father, and she calls attention to the semiotic processes linked to the maternal body. She also asserts that psychoanalysis has ignored the importance of the pre-Oedipal stage, where the semiotic takes place. And she defines it as the bodily drive associated to rhythm, tone, initial movement, and the material body. In his volume, Ecstatic Naturalism, Science of the World, published in 1994, Bloomington, Indiana, University Press, Robert Carrington has established a comparison between Kristeva's ideas and Charles Sandor Peirce's semiotics. And Carrington writes the following, which is on your screen. The presemiotic cora is itself a place of places, or a position within a series of determinate orders. It is rather the momentum or of pulsation that generates an endless stream of signs and symbols that attempt vainly to fill in the cora with delineated content. Only a presemiotic pulsation, once a presemiotic pulsation has given birth to a sign, the pulsation as a potency returns to a non-ordered stage and seeks further expression of its power. The sign becomes detached from its condition of origin, the no longer, and joins with other signs into infinite series that themselves point outwards in a variety of ways. The cora is never positioned or captured by the signs that it ejects from its hidden core. The source of signification remains wrapped in mystery. Peirce uses an unfolding triadic modalities to address what he terms firstness, secondness, and thirdness, which describe various degrees of mediation and reflexivity between representament or sign, firstness experience without reaction or cause without effect, and then the object or thing, which is secondness, a condition of mediated but not yet reflexive access, experience and reaction, cause and effect but not yet a reflection on the reaction, and interpretant. This is the thirdness, a condition of mediated reflexive access, conscious, cause-effect reactions, and their extensions to form habits, conventions, and laws. Kristeva's cora would correspond to the undifferentiated chaos of things before they become that thing in particular. First, as it unfolds into its immediate object, which is Peirce's second, and into its interpretant, which is Peirce's third. The politics of subjectivity remains at the heart of Kristeva's feminist concerns with representation, and also the influence of Lacan, Derrida, as we have seen. Kristeva centered her research towards trying to understand how semiosis always operates through the signs of socio-psychic systems of meaning. Inspired by and against Lacan, she contemplated feminism as a struggle against symbolic order, interpreted as an order monolithically patriarchal, predicted on the phallus as transcendental signifier. The term subject in process is Kristeva's substitution for the term self. She perceives subjectivity as a dynamic process which never comes to completion, always in a state of change. Moreover, the subject in process, which constitutes itself, him or herself, through a speaking subject position, is never fully aware of its personal intentions. Although the subject in process is capable of action as an autonomous being situated in the world, guided by rational and intellectual faculties, as existentialist philosophy will contend, the subject is not fully conscious of his or her intentions, some of which remain in the unconscious part of the brain. For Kristeva, subjectivity is a process that constitutes itself in symbolic language, that is situated in a given socio-cultural, ideological environment and marked in this case by hegemonic patriarchal culture, but also in the play of psychic drives and impulses, which are pre-symbolic, emotional, and semiotic, and that emerge in subversive spaces that belong to that maternal order of imagination, irrationality, and pre-linguistic, pre-symbolic spaces. Kristeva uses the term feminine in connection with this disruptive force she calls the Cora, and that signals this matrix space of unconscious and differentiated representation that bears non-linearity and chaotic patterns that become evident in modernism and in the avant-gardes in the 20th century, a time of great social anxieties caused by the two wars. The Cora precedes and underlines figuration and thus specularization, to use Lacan's term, the mirror stage, and describes the continuous rhythmic and feminine space shared by mother and child prior to the emergence of what Kristeva calls the thetic phase that prepares the sign for movement into the symbolic order. As a discharge of drives, it is also associated with and mediated by the maternal body, which, according to Kristeva, is the source of these rhythms, tones, and movements. For Kristeva, the speaking subject is a split unification of conscious and unconscious levels, of semiotic and symbolic dispositions. The semiotic marks voice, gesture, color, psychosomatic modalities connecting the physical and the social at an abstract pre-conscious level, as it does through metonymy, for example, cause-effect relations, and metaphor relations of similarity that correspond to Freud's mind properties of displacement and condensation. On the other hand, the symbolic element of signification is associated with the grammar and structure of signification, and it makes reference possible. Without the symbolic, signification will be bubble, delirium. But without the semiotic, signification will lack the emotional aspects. Ultimately, signification requires both the semiotic and the symbolic. Kristeva calls the moment through which the symbolic feminine emerges, she calls them ruptures, and she explains that they can also emerge as forms of negation and negativity, or even subversive moments of madness and unrepressed creative energy, because the masculine symbolic order represses that feminine semiotic order. Bearing in mind initial psychoanalytic dichotomies like paternal order and reason present in Lacan's symbolic, and the semiotic maternal as a place of alterity of the other, as the moments that speak the feminine, according to Kristeva, the language of art is especially apt to represent these subversive semiotic spaces that belong to the maternal order. And you have a quotation there from Shoshana Feldman, and I take the opportunity to recommend her book on Writing and Madness that exemplifies how madness can be read as the emergence of the semiotic. And Feldman says, through disruption of the symbolic function of language, we are, even if only momentarily, in breach of the law of the father, to escape the hegemony of patriarchal structures.
Mais déjà avant mon entrée en psychanalyse, en m'intéressant au langage poétique, j'ai eu le sentiment qu'il était dominé par des particularités qu'on rencontre dans les écolalies des enfants, c'est-à-dire les rythmes, les allitérations, la musique.
chacun sait que le langage poétique est musical et qu'il y a souvent même une dominance de la musique sur le sens. Quand vous prenez des textes de Mallarmé, par exemple, souvent on ne comprend pas le sens, mais on entend la musique. Donc cette dominance du musical m'a fait penser à une résurgence du pré-langage, de la musicalité des écolalies infantiles dans le langage poétique. Et qui dit écolalie, langage infantile, dit deux choses sur le plan freudien. D'abord, il s'agit de ce que nous appelons la période préédipienne, la phase préédipienne, qui est extrêmement intéressante parce que c'est toute la question du narcissisme qui se trouve là, de l'instabilité des frontières du moi, les possibilités dépressives, les possibilités psychotiques, etc. Et d'autre part, c'est une période où l'enfant est dépendant de la mère et donc il porte les traces de cette dépendance. Par conséquent, on peut extrapoler et dire que si le langage poétique met en évidence le pré-langage, la musicalité, c'est qu'en même temps, il porte témoignage de notre narcissisme, de sa fragilité, et en même temps de la relation mère-enfant. Et on voit ça très nettement dans toutes les revendications que les poètes ont fait d'être féminins, d'avoir du rapport au maternel, etc., sans nécessairement passer par l'homosexualité, ce qui peut arriver. Mais je pense par exemple à Joyce et à toute la fascination pour l'image féminine, le monologue de Molly bien entendu, mais aussi dans Finnegan's Wake, ce que je suis en train de souligner, ce côté vocal, ce côté chanté, ce côté baby talk du langage est repris dans les mots valises. Donc il y a toute une exploration dans laquelle se lance la littérature contemporaine qui tient compte de ces phases archaïques du langage, le préédipien et ses dépendances avec le maternel.
A lot of your early work was about linguistic theory and trying to demonstrate its limits, and it seems to me that the basic idea in it is that linguistic theory presupposes the existence of a speaking subject, and that you used the term semiotic to describe something to which violence was done in order that the speaking subject could be constituted. The question I wanted to ask is, were you trying to imply that orthodox academic linguistic theory, say generativism, was mistaken, or just that it was not sufficiently aware of its presuppositions?
Bon, je ne pense pas que les théories linguistiques modernes sont erronées. Je pense simplement qu'elles ont une tradition épistémologique qui a dessiné leur objet et leur sujet, et que dans ce cadre, elles font ce qu'elles peuvent, elles vont très loin, mais qu'elles ne touchent pas à la dynamique et aux symptômes subjectifs qui me paraissent, moi, importants dans la vie sociale, mais aussi dans ce que j'écoute sur le divan. Pour être plus clair, la tradition épistémologique sur laquelle repose la linguistique contemporaine a été explicitée par Chomsky comme étant l'ego cogito, Descartes. On peut aller plus loin et considérer que les théories du discours, Searle, Speech Acts, Austin, la théorie d'énonciation en France, sont un développement de cette linguistique cartésienne et se rapprochent de quelque chose qui pourrait être l'ego transcendantal de Husserl, de la phénoménologie. Mais de toutes les façons, il s'agit, dans tous ces cas-là de la linguistique, qu'elle soit chomskienne ou qu'elle soit speech act, de quelque chose qui considère une séparation entre le sujet et l'objet et une solidité de la conscience parlante. Or, c'est justement cette solidité-là et cette séparation qui sont mises en cause dans les états pathologiques, mais aussi dans les états de mobilité du code social, dans les états de révolte, d'innovation, de création. Et c'est pour cela que j'ai essayé de proposer un modèle qui puisse rendre compte de ces situations dynamiques, où le sens n'est pas toujours déjà donné, mais où il est une dynamique. Ce que j'appelle la signifiance, en prenant le suffixe iance, qui est un héritage du Moyen-Âge, le terme était employé par la linguistique médiévale, mais qui montre la dynamique du processus. Et pour rendre compte mieux de cette dynamique, je parle de deux modalités qui constituent la signifiance. D'une part, le sémiotique, qui renvoie aux écolalies, ce qu'on a dit tout à l'heure, les vocalises de l'enfant avant que le signe et la syntaxe n'existent, et d'autre part, le signe et la syntaxe, que j'appelle symbolique, et l'articulation des deux fait cette dynamique du langage, si on veut l'entendre. Alors, cette dynamique est très nette dans certaines expériences. Si vous prenez le langage poétique, on parlait de Joyce tout à l'heure, cette dynamique est présente aussi chez les auteurs classiques. Si vous prenez un Balzac, et vous voulez écouter la rythmique de sa phrase, vous pouvez l'entendre, même si ce n'est pas au premier niveau, ce n'est pas sa préoccupation principale, mais c'est toujours là. Cette dynamique existe aussi, mais elle est réprimée dans le discours, disons, didactique ou de la science ou le discours politique où ces phénomènes musicaux, pulsionnels, affectifs sont de plus en plus maîtrisés et on a tendance plutôt à les évacuer. Donc il y a une typologie de discours qui constitue notre expérience humaine et qu'on pourrait constituer à partir de ces notions que je propose de sémiotique et de symbolique, mais qui s'intéresse donc encore une fois surtout aux états critiques du langage et aux possibilités de modification et d'évolution. Donc je ne pense pas que la linguistique est erronée, mais elle a un objet limité qui relève d'une histoire.
Kristeva, however, detaches femininity from the female subject, and thus her ideas have the advantage of working against fixed sexual identities, freeing women from femininity and moving towards post-structuralist theories of feminism, which emerged in the last part of the second feminist wave in the 1980s. She places women theoretically on the side of the explosion of social codes with revolutionary moments, and this is a quote, but claims that because of their social position, they actually tend to align themselves with symbolic power. In avant-garde art, Kristeva sees semiotic operations that she identifies what she calls the polylogical subject. The polylogue is primarily musical and material. It is the rhythm of the unconscious before it is repressed and dematerialized in the signifying symbolic system of language. It forces language out of the transcendental position by means of multiplication and breaks through the boundaries of the symbolic. It can be seen in the pre-syntactic enunciations of children and also in madness, as we have mentioned, which often becomes her object of study as well. In literary critical practice, this means that men, because of their social power, become the greatest marginal revolutionary writers, according to Kristeva. And she names, for example, James Joyce, Antonin Artaud, Stéphane Mallarmé. She mentions Virginia Woolf, but according to her, Woolf does not disrupt the symbolic in such a revolutionary way as Joyce does. One of the problems in Kristeva's theory, however, as argued by later feminists, is that it does not enable the possibility of a lasting transformation of these symbolic patriarchal structures. I want to finish mentioning Kristeva's theory of the object, which she developed in the book Pouvoir de Horreur, which was translated at Powers of Horror in 1980. And in the context of the health problems that her son suffered, which put him on the verge of death. Powers of Horror theorizes the space between the semiotic and the symbolic, between subject and object, by using the concept of the object, which defines the boundaries around the subject in terms of what is cast out as other. According to Kristeva, the object marks a primal order that escapes signification in the symbolic order. The term is used to refer to human relations and reactions of fear and horror that threaten the breakdown in meaning caused by the loss of the distinction between subject and object, that is, between self and other. So the concept essentially concerns the problematic corporeality of the subject, which the symbolic order seeks to transcend. Kristeva argues that personal identity is constituted by excluding anything that threatens one's own, one's group borders. The limits of our physical bodies are, in this sense, perceived as the limits of ourselves. Kristeva situates the object within the semiotic, the pre-symbolic pre-language space associated with the mother, which refers to the moment in which psychosexual development is going to be established as a border of separation between human and animal, between culture and what it preceded it, a sort of an archaic memory. Kristeva explains, by way of adjective, primitive societies have marked out a precise area of their culture in order to remove it from the threatening world of animals or animalism, which were imagined as representatives of sex and murder, she explains. She goes on to argue that discourse is always a negotiation between these boundaries and their collapse, and constantly threatening to question the subject's feelings of completeness, of distinction from the others. So the object embodies both the fear of losing self-distinction, but also a desire of a loss of the self. A return to that semiotic stage when the child does not yet see herself as a self, separated from the mother's body.
Sometimes, however, politicians can take advantage of our gag reflexes by exploiting our disgust for their political causes. Take Trump, for instance. Trump appealed to conservative notions of purity to justify his misogyny. When Trump wanted to criticize journalist Megyn Kelly for her line of questioning, he said, "There was blood coming out of her you-know-what." He was attempting to use a bodily function to create disgust and revulsion instead of meeting her at an intellectual level. How abject. On October 1st, 2017, a gunman opened fire into a large crowd from his hotel room in Las Vegas, Nevada. This incident is now considered the deadliest mass shooting in recent American history, and the shooter's motive is still unknown. Theories about the killer became rampant in the aftermath of the shooting because so many people wanted to understand the why, the meaning behind the action. Kristeva says that any crime, because it draws attention to the fragility of law, is abject, but premeditated crime, cunning murder, hypocritical revenge, are even more so because they heighten the display of such fragility. The shooting in Las Vegas was premeditated. The gunman spent a lot of time planning it and purchasing weapons. His crime was abject. And as is often the case with these types of crimes, we label the perpetrator as a lone wolf. We distance ourselves. We reject them and their ideologies. We create our identities by expelling the other. And what about our day-to-day? Does experiencing loss of meaning always have to be so extreme? Many of us have experienced spaces that lack meaning without realizing it. In the same way that rotten food presents us with a dilemma because it is at once potential nourishment and potentially dangerous, there are spaces that exist between two worlds. These are called liminal spaces. For instance, that staircase to your class, or your job, or your apartment is a liminal space. The tunnel under the highway is, too. The time you spend taxiing on an airport runway, a hospital waiting room. These are all places that are not about themselves. None of us purposefully hang out and grab a coffee in a clinic waiting room for fun. Liminal spaces exist in between meaning. They are throughways to another place. This is why it feels slightly worrying when we're awake at 3:30 in the morning while everyone else is sleeping. Or why abandoned buildings are so creepy, or why we might get a chill if we see an empty playground at midnight. We know the context that we're supposed to have for these places, but it's lacking. The usual meaning we've associated with these places has broken down, and we tend to try to avoid these places whenever possible because they are unsettling and even abject. Abjection, according to Kristeva, is a process by which we form our identities. We are presented with dilemmas, objects and places that straddle two worlds at once, like life and death, or nourishment and poison. When we see these things, we get a gut reaction, and we are forced to choose which side we're on. Maybe this is why so many of us love watching horror movies or reading scary stories. We can reject what we find repugnant, and we can get a better sense of who we are. I am not Pennywise, the dancing clown.
Kristeva's example of the corpse, the future of every embodied subject, shows how the object shifts the border between life and death, revealing a necessary relation that the symbolic order can tolerate only through repression or in the form of sublimation in art. According to her, in the art created by male subjects, which includes forms of unconscious maternal semiotic, the object is found in the disparate and contradictory elements the organic imagination seeks to unify. There has been much criticism on Kristeva's ideas because of her ethnocentrism. For example, Gayatri Spivak has criticized Kristeva's volume on Chinese women, which appeared in 1974 after the Telltale Group visited China. Spivak has said that Kristeva generalizes and writes about 2,000 years of culture that she's unfamiliar with. And also my friend and colleague Ian Almond, in his volume The New Orientalists, Postmodern Representation of Islam from Foucault to Baudrillard, has noted the dismissive terminology that Kristeva uses to describe Muslim culture and Islamic societies. Ian teaches at Georgetown University in Qatar, and he has visited us in Complutense on a couple of occasions, and his videos are available in our website for you to listen to. We move on to Hélène Cixous, who established the first European Center of Feminist Studies at a university in University Paris 8. Like Jacques Derrida, Cixous had been born in French Algeria, family of doctors, and in 1968 she finished her doctoral dissertation in English literature, working on James Joyce and his exile. She entitled it The Exile of James Joyce or the Art of Displacement. Although she has pursued an academic career, Cixous is a novelist and has published 23 volumes of poems, 6 books of essays, 5 plays, as well as many academic articles and books. She has had a close relationship with Derrida, and together they have established much of post-structuralist feminist theory, together with Kristeva and the Belge Lucie Ligaray. Already in her dissertation, Cixous wrote about the relationship between sexuality and language. And she believes that reading, writing are not transparent operations of language, and that they are acts of appropriation that help the speaking subject to take a place or a position which necessarily constitute a political as well as a gendered space of power. So for this reason, speaking, reading, and writing are places of action and political affirmation where to articulate the strategies of feminist discourse. So Cixous has became very interested in what she terms écriture féminin, a form of writing that takes the perspective of the female and her experiences and moves away from patriarchal systems. In 1975, Cixous published her most influential article, La Rive de la Méduse, The Laugh of Medusa, which was translated into English in 1976. It encourages women to use writing and body and as sources of power and inspiration. According to Cixous, a feminine text cannot fail to be more than subversive. It is volcanic in order to smash everything, to shatter the framework of institutions, to blow up the law, to shatter the truth with laughter. If a woman has always functioned within the discourse of man, a signifier that has always referred back to the opposite signifier, which annihilates its specific energy and diminishes or stifles its very different sounds, it's time for her to dislocate this within, to explode it, turn it around, seize it and make it hers, containing it, taking it into her own mouth, biting that tongue with her very own teeth to invent for herself a language to get inside of. And you'll see with what ease she will spring forth from that within, the within where once she so drowsily crouched to overflow at the lips, she will cover the foam. As seen, all the French feminists react to the idea of the Lacanian feminine. Lac, which Lacan inherited from Freud. Following Derrida, they argued that while men are defined by logocentric qualities that are present, strength, power, activity, women are defined by absence, weakness, instability, mutability, all characterized by lack. Cixous argues that this stems from the anatomical differences between men and women. The penis is, when erect, undeniable present, whereas the vagina remains hidden, dark, at once terrifying and fascinating. In the 1980s, Cixous would continue to explore women's novelists in particular that would fulfill her dream of writing that inscribed femininity. And she examined modernist and avant-garde women writers under radical forms of écriture féminin, and in her volume, White Ink, she speaks, like Kristeva, of a reunion with the maternal body, a place where there is no lack or separation, and thus no categories. Cixous explores the work of previous writers like Virginia Woolf or Kate Chopin, to unveil motherhood as a catalyst or constraint for women's writing.
As for the word intellectual, for me it's connotated in a horrible way. In France, it always refers to a certain class of people who are actually designed and selected by the mass medias. And there has been an issue of the weekly Nouvel Observateur recently. It's not the first time, but this is very recent. And there's a large paper on the intellectuals who lead French thinking in 1992. And about a year ago, it was dedicated to those who were going to lead the 21st century. And then you take the list, which is absolutely haphazard, heterogeneous, etc., there's never one woman. Never. They don't exist ever. No scientist, no writer, nothing. But that's, the concept intellectual. It's reserved, it's a caste. It's incredible. So I don't like it.
As seen during the second feminist wave in the 1960s, critics mostly from the United States, such as Gilbert and Goober or Showalter, and their notion of gynocriticism, emphasized the study and canonical inclusion of works by female authors, as well as the depiction of women in male author canonical texts. In the late 70s and 80s, we have seen that new paradigms and intellectual premises were introduced, most of them coming from Europe and France in particular. These new trends emphasize the fact that although the Western philosophical tradition, Lacan as well as Heidegger, Sartre or Foucault, among many others, were instrumental in exposing the subject beyond its grammatical sense as a category constituted in language and through language, in a never-ending process, the sphere of discourse of signifiers, which are the carriers of meaning, designated by convention, has constituted to be part of what Lacan termed the symbolic order and the law of the father. And here the hierarchical, patriarchal structure of culture has repressed and ignored the experience of women in the structure of ideas. So this is why feminists in the late 70s and 80s explored discursive practice and these practices of erasure and invisibility, which have been performed upon women's life and experiences, eliminating them from the sphere of writing and the preservation of historical memory. It is for this reason that Kristeva, Cixous, Lucy de Garay, the British Mary Jacobus, in her book Gynesis, Configurations of Women and Modernity, they all insist in encouraging writing as a mode of inscription in the symbolic order. Their work beyond the first descriptive stage of the second feminist wave becomes an intervention in the history of theoretical discourse, an attempt to alter the existing categories and systems of thought that were established upon Western male rationality. All of them posit feminist writing or écriture féminin as a mode of inscription in this symbolic order, and they challenge what they have called logocentric phallic order and the domination of one mode of signifying the symbolic over the other, the semiotic. However, since, as Derrida insisted, meaning is never truly present because it is endlessly deferred, it is created in an infinite process of referring one signified to another signified in an endless change. Writing, as Christopher Norris has argued in his book dealing with deconstruction, becomes an endless displacement of meaning, which, although it governs language, it also places it forever beyond the reach of a stable, self-authenticating knowledge. So it is difficult for the feminist literary tradition to assert a presence that has never been there in the first place. And thus, while most of these energetic and energizing writings of the French feminism during the 70s and 90s pushed the entry of sexual difference into the feminist debate in terms of language, it did not solve the problems of women's lack of power, visibility, and so on. Indeed, new problems emerged during the late 80s that required feminist critics to be more pluralistic in their methodologies and theories. North American critic Tori Moy argument in Sexual Textual Politics from 1985 is that without an aesthetic effect there will be no political effect, so that the only way to challenge and disrupt the patriarchal tradition and its dominant discourses is to work deconstructively from within the tradition and within its own assumptions. So Moe initiated a sharp socialist feminist critique from the Anglo-European point of view of the politics of the North American feminist essentialists of the 1960s, Ellen Showalter and company. Besides, for Toril Moe, the term female does not imply a political or feminist position, it implies a gender difference. So female writing can be taken as the special female expression of women's perspectives on a variety of social, cultural, and political issues, without being committed to that feminist position. She argued that no female writing should be explained in terms of gender, nor in terms of collective experience of women.
So then, when I arrived in England, I think that was the making of me, because that's when people were starting to read Lacan and Foucault and all these French theorists, and also starting to pay attention to these new French voices. People like Irigaray, Sixou, and Kristeva started to publish in French, in the feminist stuff in French, in the mid-70s, anytime from, say, 72 to 75. And they hadn't been translated yet, or very little. If you look at the bibliography, you will see how many texts I quote in the original French, because they just don't, now they exist in English. But they exist in English partly because I wrote about them.
Exactly.
So I realized that, there's all this exciting theory that I didn't know about in Norway yet. Because in Norway, Bergen, it was known as the center for postmodernism in Norway, literature in Bergen. But that didn't really start to happen until later in the 80s. So when I left at the end of the 70s, we were on to structuralism and hermeneutics and German theories and so on, but not those new French people. So I realized in Oxford that I had one great advantage. I was a scholar of French. I could read all these people. So I got a fellowship in Cambridge, Clare Hall, Cambridge, and spent the whole year reading Révolution du langage poétique. I read all the French stuff, and then, that was in 81, 82. Then I realized I know how to write this book. And then I started it, and it was written in 2 years.
Wow.
I can't believe it. I just could never do that now.
Wow, that's amazing. Youth.
Yes.
So the book, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, the first part deals with Anglo-American trends in literary criticism and a kind of approach that was common to feminist critics like Elaine Showalter or Gilbert and Gubar, a couple of other women. And then the second half looks at trends in French feminism, focusing on Hélène Sixou, Luce Irigaray, and Julik Receiver. And I really think, it's interesting to see the divide. I would like to know if you think there still is such a stark divide in terms of who's doing what, Anglo versus French. But that French section in your book, I think, was really fundamental in terms of inventing a kind of French feminist theory, or a way of seeing French, what was taken to be French feminist theory in the States and perhaps in the UK as well, that was not actually as monolithic as people took it to be. I think they just looked at your book, at the second half of your book, and was like, right, Sixou, Irigaray, and Kristeva, these are the French feminists, but then they themselves, as you point out in the book, don't necessarily see themselves as having anything in common or even being feminists necessarily. So I guess my question, now that I've sort of laid that out, is how do you see that Anglo-French divide working today, and what is the kind of status of French theory in general, across the world?
Well, it's a really difficult question because, back in I suppose France was the metropolis for theory ever since, let's say, the existentialists, Sartre and Beauvoir after World War II. And of course, my heroine of all these people is Simone de Beauvoir, whom I don't write about here. That became the next book. So for, I think, a whole generation or even 2 generations, people intellectuals would go to Paris, first to study Sartre and Beauvoir and Merleau-Ponty, and then in the next move there was Foucault, and there was Lacan, and there was Irigaray, and Cixous, and Kristeva, and there were lots of others, of course, as well. Personally, I've always really liked the work of Michel Ledeuf and Christine Delphi, for example.
Similarly, another North American, Barbara Johnson, defended that rhetorical, psychoanalytical, and political structures are profoundly implicated in one another, and that deconstruction is political because the task of the writer, and I quote, would seem to be to narrate both the appeal and the injustice of universalization in a voice that assumes and articulates its own ever-differing self-difference. So Johnson uses the example of African American women writers, in particular Zora Neale Hurston. Their Eyes Were Watching God from 1937, to signal an ambivalent positionality in the cultural and critical subject position of these writers. Similarly, British scholar Jacqueline Rose has also argued that the instability of subject positions is not reducible to a series of language games, rhetorical devices, or tropes, as deconstruction has signaled, addressing the entry into the symbolic order. According to Rose, although the psychic in language operates through repetitions, displacement, condensation, projection, metonymy, metaphor, and so on, deconstruction cannot solve the problems of how the psychic and the social operate because, and I quote, dispatching of the subject and its dissolution into a writing strategy leads to the political demand for its return. For the political necessity of the subject is met, in part, by the psychic necessity of the subject, but in a way which finds itself suspended between each of these demands, for this subject is neither pure assertion nor play. So this is the concept of liminality that we mentioned before. In the following video, Jacqueline Rose is talking about Lacan, and after that you will see an extract from a British TV program from the 1979 debating on the lack of women writers, in particular in school books, for example.
Jacqueline, I'm interested in your thoughts about Jacques Lacan when you came to Lacan's work first, and your transition, perhaps the transition over the decades, in terms of what did you find valuable at the start, in the middle, and at the end? Well, not
I'm
really
at the end, am I?
Not really at the end. Still in transition.
Well, I'm not sure I can do it quite in the sequence that you suggested, but what attracted me to Lacan was that I thought he was a scandalous thinker. And we have to remember that, you know, he wasn't Freud, Viennese patriarch, living in an establishment world, or even that's controversial because Vienna was hardly an establishment city after all, as Skolsky has demonstrated. But he wrote for Minotaur, he wrote for the Surrealists. He really wanted to bring out the dissolute in psychoanalysis, not the disseminated a la Jacques Derrida, but the dissolute in psychoanalysis. And I found that very, very exhilarating. And I also found his outrageous statements about women, like, you know, there is no sexual relation and the woman does not exist. I found all that incredibly encouraging and liberating, because it's as if he was taking a certain phantasmagoria of what women are meant to be and just putting a red mark through it and saying, think again. And the absolutely arbitrary nature of sexual difference. I found all that very challenging, and I just wanted to, translating it was a way of trying to understand it. I've worked much less with Lacan in the last few years, or probably the last decade. I've gone much more back into Freud. And I can't really give a simple answer to that. I mean, I still do Lacan's ethics seminar, which I didn't know when I was much younger, I still think is his most brilliant seminar on what Lacan has to say about ethical life and the difficulty of ethical life through his reading of Antigone and so on. But I have been working much, much more with Freud in the last few years and people like Christopher Bolas. I mean, I just think there's something in Freud all the time which challenges me and excites me still. And so I don't feel like that's not a good answer. I'm really sorry. But it's ongoing. Ça ne cesse pas de s'écrire. Forgive me, that's Lacan's account of the symptom. Ça ne cesse pas de s'écrire. It never ceases to be written, which say that these little moments of opening and breakage and symptomatic collapse are there for the whole time, all the time. And one of the tasks of a certain kind of political analysis, I think, is to go for them and expose them every time they appear. And I like to think that changes the terms of the discourse. But it's very tricky what you said, because it will initiate a kind of bring the barriers back down, and very ugly things then can happen. But yeah, no, it's a great question. Thank you.
The English programme.
There have been plenty of excellent women writers, but writing, like most other activities, has been traditionally dominated by men who write about men's interests from a man's point of view. If you think about the books that you're studying at school, chances are that most of them have been written by men. Why is this? Well, to talk about this, as well as our usual group of students, we've got Susan Hemmings from the women's liberation magazine Spare Rib, Faye Weldon, who's written stories, novels and TV plays, and Linda Dawson, an English teacher. Well, if we could start with you, Susan, why do you think that men writers get set on syllabuses far more than women writers?
Well, I think there's very little doubt that, as you said, even though ideas have changed, we still live in a society which is fundamentally sexist. All societies have a system of privileges, and it's still true to say that the people who have the privileges in this society are men. And so it doesn't come as any surprise to any of us, I think, that the books that are taught in schools, whether it's on O-level syllabus, English, or in physics or whatever, are predominantly written by men, about men's ideas, and basically for boys.
Linda, I mean, as a teacher, would you agree with that?
Well, I think that's true. I think that teachers are beginning to think about things like sexism in literature and are beginning to make choices of books that are by women, for women, about women. But it takes a long time for changes to happen in schools, particularly in syllabuses, because sometimes it takes 2 years before a board will change, and you've got stock and things like that to take into consideration. So changes that are happening now perhaps won't actually appear in examination syllabuses anyway for some years to come. So.
What sort of difference does it actually make? I mean, that the books are written by men. Do you think there's an essential difference between books that are written by men and books that are written by women?
It's a very difficult question to answer. Yes, of course there is. I mean, speaking as a human being, not as a writer, I know that no book I read until I was about 25 made any sense to me at all. I didn't understand who all these people were, or what they were doing, or why they were feeling that. And that is, I think, because the books were written by women who were very nervous about expressing themselves in any way, who wrote not about their true feelings or their true experiences, but what they thought would make a good impression on men.
What sort of effects do you think this can have on people?
Well, it's extremely confusing.
I think you've got a problem insofar as there aren't that many books about women that you could actually use on the syllabus. I mean, you said that there are certain kinds of books which, because the writers were nervous about expressing women's consciousness, that they wouldn't be suitable, and isn't that still a problem?
Yes, indeed. I suppose that the books that women write are sexually explicit, and teachers are naturally nervous because of what the parents say and because of the different religions and attitudes which we have all existing at the same time in our society. It's very difficult for them to give it to children, and since I suppose in my books a lot of it depends upon people's sexual attitudes, you can't take that out and have a sensible book left. And that is, it seems to be a problem.
I don't think it's only explicitness. I think also a lot of the books that women are writing now about women are about women of 25 upwards.
Yes.
And perhaps teachers don't feel that the kind of issues that are being discussed in those books or being explored in those books are the kind of issues that are going to be terribly relevant to somebody of 15.
So as an example of some of the concerns brought by these critics of the 1970s and 80s, I would like to present the work, however briefly, of some women authors with significant contributions in addressing the concerns of language and subjectivity within their artistic works. On the one hand, Mina Gertrude Lowry, known as Mina Loy, a British-born artist, writer, poet, playwright, novelist, painter, and designer of lamps. She was from Hungarian Jewish descent and one of the last of the first-generation modernists to achieve posthumous recognition. Her poetry was much admired by T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, William Carlos Williams, Gertrude Stein, Francis Picabia, among many others. Loy had studied painting at an academy in Montparnasse in Paris in the early 1900s. And in Becoming Modern, The Life of Mina Loy, her biographer, Caroline Burke, explained that Loy got pregnant and married an English artist and photographer in a kind of marriage of convenience that led to her poem Parturition, which was published in 1914. You have a short extract on your screen. Apparently, while Loy was in labor through the night, her husband, Stephen Howes, was absent with his mistress. And male irresponsibility is a common theme in Loy's poetry in general, not just in this poem. I am the center of a circle of pain, exceeding its boundaries in every direction. The business of the blunt sun has no affair with me. I am congested cosmos of agony from which there is no escape. The irresponsibility of the male leaves woman her superior inferiority. He is running upstairs. Loy's child Oda died 1 year later of meningitis. In 1907, the couple moved to Florence, and there Loy met Gertrude Stein and André Gide and a big group of expatriates. And she wrote in 1914 her Feminist Manifesto, which was the first Feminist Manifesto ever written. It was a polemic piece against the subordinate position of women in society, and it remained unpublished during Loy's lifetime. The year before, Loy became involved with the Italian Futurists, becoming a lover of Marinetti first and later of Giovanni Papini. American artist and editor Alfred Grimborg dedicated an entire issue of his journal Others to the publication of Loy's long poem Song to Johannes in 1915. The poem, an extract on your screen, was an embittered account of her frustrating relationships with the Futurists. In 1916, she moved to New York, where she began acting with the Provincetown Players, working alongside Man Ray, William Carlos Williams, Marcel Duchamp, Marianne Moore, and the Dadaist Arthur Cravan. Loy divorced and married Cravan in Mexico City in 1918, and soon after, she traveled to Buenos Aires, where she was supposed to meet Cravan, which was at the time testing a boat. He never appeared and was presumably drowned. After Cravan's disappearance or death, Loy traveled back to England, where she gave birth to a daughter. In 1923, she returned to Paris, and her first volume of poetry, Lunar Baedeker, a collection of 31 poems, was published. Loy also resumed old friendships with Duna Barnes and Gertrude Stein. An important feminist critic who worked on the women from the expatriate community in Paris and their importance in the 20th century avant-garde was Shari Goodman, who published under the name Shari Benstock. She was an expert on literary modernism and a biographer of Edith Wharton. Her volume, Women of the Left Bank, provided a fascinating account to all these women and their relationships. Benstock also shows the appropriations that the creativity and their works suffered in the hands of their male counterparts. Among the women exploring this volume is Mina Loy and her circle of modernist, futurists, and Dadaist friends. Leonora Carrington is another fascinating woman who, like Mina Loy, had various artistic registers. Carrington was a founding member of the women's liberation movement in Mexico during the 70s, the daughter of a British wealthy textile manufacturer, and who had studied art at Mrs. Penrose Academy in Florence. In 1936, Leonora met Max Ernst, who had an exhibition at the International Surrealist Exhibition in London, and she was fascinated by his paintings. They bonded, and eventually Ernst separated from his wife, and they moved to France. During the outbreak of the World War II, because he was German, he was arrested by the French authorities. And he managed to escape and left Carrington behind and fled to the United States with the help of Peggy Guggenheim, because Ernst also had some Jewish background. After Ernst's arrest, Carrington was devastated and she fled to Spain. And after an increase in depression and a sexual assault in Madrid, she broke down. She was hospitalized in Santander and given convulsive therapy and treated with drugs that eventually were banned. And she narrates this event in a volume entitled Down Below, published in 1944. And she tells all about her horrible experience in this hospital. And meanwhile, Ernst and Peggy Guggenheim had gotten married in New York and later divorced. No, Carrington eventually made her way to Mexico, and she resided there until her death. Besides her paintings, Carrington wrote surrealist short stories mostly, and which constitute an exceptional corpus hardly explored. Some research has been carried out by my friend and colleague Mercedes Jiménez de la Fuente, who continues to try to make Carrington's work better known in Spain. It is also important to mention the contributions of post-colonial criticism and writing, particularly after the 1980s. Post-colonial voices began to show how within a society there is a culture that is perceived as central and dominant, and that privileges that the perspective of power marginalize other voices, the voices of colonized cultures, which are subjected or even silenced, just like women have been. These colonized or post-colonial cultures and their discourses present a series of characteristics or strategies, often subversive and different from those of the dominant discourse, whose origin is precisely their experience and situation of marginality, and whose objective is a countercultural aesthetics of dissent. Given that feminist discourse can be conceptualized as part of culture colonized within another dominant culture that is male culture, it is not surprising that we find many features that do not respond to generic or sexual questions, but rather derive from this experience of post-coloniality of women within patriarchal society. But there are also a variety of other women's experiences that do not respond to a unified conception of feminism, and that it was presented by the first, as it was presented by first and second waves. As indicated at the start of this video, a current name, intersectionality, has sought to understand how aspects of a person's social and political identities, gender, race, class, sexuality, combine to create diverse modes of discrimination. And for more information about the authors on your screen, please refer to my videos on postcolonial criticism. Let's talk briefly again about Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, herself a cultural product of at least three geopolitical contexts: the Indian subcontinent of her birth, the world of European theory, which she helped to bring to America as early translator of Jacques Derrida, and the United States, where she lives and teaches at Columbia University in New York. A leading deconstructionist, Spivak's work reflects on the privileged ethnocentric position of Western feminism, with a whole institutional framework that contributes to the translation, distribution, and dissemination of the feminist texts of the First World, mostly written in English, while maintaining the invisibility of the Second and Third World feminist agendas. For example, in her paper, Three Women's Text and Critique of Imperialism, from 1985, Spivak explains how texts such as Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre or Virginia Woolf's, they have become cult texts in feminist humanistic studies, but they pay no attention to the important class-racial resonances that appear there and that articulate the axioms of imperialism, according to Spivak. Her most important contribution to the postcolonial debate has been the notion of the subaltern consciousness. Starting from Derrida's model of deconstruction, as well as Gramsci's concept of the subaltern, Spivak takes a particular and radical turn to elaborate her critique of the knowledge and cultural representation systems in the Western world, exploring the consequences of the involvement of intellectuality in the elaboration of knowledge. Like the French feminists, for example, you have seen the video by Cixous in which she talks about intellectualism. Spivak rejects any form of a stable identity and emphasizes the idea of the decentralized subject, and she constructs her theory of the subaltern as a subordinate subject and its impossible position in relation to discourse and representation.
Now, when I look back, I did indeed look back because there has been a bit of a wonderful feminist brouhaha about Can the Subaltern Speak? I like that, especially since its 20th anniversary coincides with the 20th anniversary of the admission of women into Columbia College. So good. Okay, so I've been looking at the essay a bit more, and what I have noticed is that whatever I wrote at the time of revision, I was already using the more specific sense of without access to the lines of social mobility in the piece, Can the Subaltern Speak? Subaltern in the sense of without access to the lines of social mobility, rather than the name of a difference. And the example was a woman. That was Can the Subaltern Speak? What remained, however, in place was the designation of subaltern studies as questioning colonial, nationalist, as well as Marxist historiography. Subalternity, therefore, for me, has also always been, I gave you the first sense, in binary opposition to the nation state as it is now to the so-called international civil society, which Shell mentioned. For me, there are no subaltern nations, to quote Hart and Negri, and the subalternism, to quote my dear friend Homi, the subalternism of the contemporary NGO culture and world governance enthusiasts is a recoding and re-territorialization of the US doctrine of manifest destiny. So that particular sense of the subaltern as in binary opposition to those things, that has remained. Now, I should say now, as you know, people know this is not a secret, but I think it's worth talking about this so that the difference in the trajectory becomes clear, so that people don't say, this I forgot to say, there are also people who kind of love me, who decide to say, as Valerie Ritter just said in Chicago, that I was a founding member of the Subaltern Studies Collective. Someone said, apparently Dipesh told me in Melbourne, while Ranjita was standing in the audience, some woman asked him, have you heard of Gayatri Spivak and the Subaltern Studies Group? So this is also really extremely, I mean, it's not my fault if people should do this. It's for comparable reasons that my husband's left me. Public recognition, you can't do anything. You can't, this is a predicament. I mean, you can't go and tell each member of the public, don't talk nonsense, you know? And given the patriarchal nature of the world, that means a lonely life. Anyway, to come back to, and this is my situation also with the subaltern studies stuff. Anyway, to come back, it's a story which is a slightly different story, yes? The story was, and I've told this before, so it's nothing private, the story was that in '81, I was asked to write as a specialist on deconstruction by Yale French Studies and also by critical inquiry. Imagine how the times have changed. But at that point, for some reason, I thought, and I don't know the reason, I wouldn't think so this way now, I thought, well, how is it that I have just become a specialist in French theory? And then I turned to my own class, Bhuvaneshwari Bhaduri. The woman in Can the Subaltern Speak was my grandmother's sister. Yeah? And I never wrote that in Can the Subaltern Speak because I knew that, you know, I'm a theoretical person. I knew that if I said so, then I would get a lot of enthusiasm from my readers saying, oh, isn't Gayatri Spivak wonderful, her grandmother's sister, and so on. So I never, also my mother was a bit worried about this. My mother said, you're going to use her name. I said, Ma, you'll see, nobody will pay any attention to it. And as Howie Winant knows, and he's smiling away, I got many, 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 many hostile and negative responses as having silenced the subaltern, except for one in the pages of Socialist Review, Can the Subaltern Vote, which was a wonderful piece coming from Nicaragua. But at any rate, so therefore I did not mention it, but I turned to my own class, the Bengali middle class. So on the one hand, Bhuvaneshwari Bhaduri, and on the other hand, Mahashweta Devi. Absolutely, the class from which I came. From French theory, that's all I could do. But I did not remain there. The problems that emerged out of Can the Subaltern Speak were A, the problem of subjectship and agency, and B, the call to build infrastructure in the colloquial, not the Marxist sense.
Similarly, Nancy Armstrong, following a Foucauldian perspective, situates genre as a product of capitalism and empire in her book from 1987, Desire and Domestic Fiction, arguing that domestic fiction actively sought to disentangle the language of sexual relations from the language of politics, and in doing so introduced new forms of political power that sought to endorse universal forms of subjectivity. Armstrong's interests have been directed to Native American literature, as you can see on your screen. In Black Feminist Criticism from 1985, Barbara Christian emphasized the difference among white feminist humanists and the experience of black diaspora, deploying any universalizing common concepts with regards to what it means to be a woman. So the need to center historical and cultural specificity when questioning the textual politics, ideological frameworks, and generic conventions used by Black women writers is also discussed by the following critics listed on your screen. The experience of women as post-colonial subjects translates into what has been called the bitextuality of female discourse. On the one hand, seeking the approval of the dominant culture, they write works that seem to support patriarchal ideology.
The very first book I wrote, called The Bluest Eye, was when I was not really thinking about publishing or reviewers or other readers. It was a book I wanted to read, and I couldn't find it anywhere. So I began to write it, and it took forever because it had no real reason for being done except my own reading pleasure. It was like a long reading exercise that took 5 years. So when I would read it and I didn't like it a bit, I would change it. I think it's been very helpful for me to look at it as a reader because it gives you distance. Your ego is not all entangled in it, and you're not just thrilled with it because you wrote it. And some writers really prefer to be authors. Those are people who write because that's what they do, or someone has asked them, or they have a contract. I really call myself now a writer because I only write when I can't not do it, when I'm so compelled to do it. And part of it is what I presume will be, since I'm a very good reader and a very fastidious and careful reader, very picky about what I like, I would try to write the kind of book that I really wanted to read.
It's brilliant because, in fact, I mean, it's reading is the whole way in to a writer anyway, isn't it?
Of course.
It's got to be. But why did you then, you had a good job as a publisher's editor.
That's right.
Lecturer? Was a lecturer before or after that?
A little bit during that time, yes.
Same. So lecturer, editor, so you're already immersed in books,
Yes.
other people's books. But you were fairly late starting to write yourself. Now, what made you write, start you off writing?
I think the situation was one in which my back was really up against the wall. I was recently divorced. I had small children. I had a new job. I lived in a small city then. That part of the company was in a place that was strange to me. And I knew that the company was going to move to New York City. So I didn't make any friends because I thought I would leave them soon. In short, I was miserable, absolutely. And even though I had a lot of responsibilities, it's amazing how much time there is when you're unhappy. Some people fill up their misery with parties and dinners and so on. But if you don't do that, the children go to sleep at 7, and then there's a long night before you have to get up the next morning. And that's when I wanted to read this book, because that's what I'd always done in downtime or uptime. I am a reader. And at that time, I was 30, and I really wanted a certain kind of experience I wanted to share. Didn't analyze it terribly much, but I knew that I wanted to read about people like me.
There is no such thing as race. None.
Really?
There's just a human race, scientifically,
Mm-hmm.
anthropologically. Racism is a construct, a social construct, and it has benefits. It has money can be made off of it. People who don't like themselves can feel better because of it. It can describe certain kinds of behavior that are wrong or misleading. So it has a social function, racism. But race can only be defined as a human being.
If the racist white person, I don't mean the person who is examining his consciousness and so on, doesn't understand that he or she is also a race, it's also constructed, it's also made, and it also has some kind of serviceability. But when you take it away, I take your race away. And there you are, all strung out, and all you got is your little self. And what is that? What are you without racism? Are you any good? Are you still strong? You still smart? You still like yourself? If you can only be tall because somebody's on their knees, then you have a serious problem. And my feeling is white people
have a very, very serious problem. And they should start thinking about what they can do about it. Take me out of it.
You don't think you will ever change and write books that incorporate white lives into them substantially?
I have done.
In a substantial way?
You can't understand how powerfully racist that question is, can you? Because you could never ask a white author, when are you going to write about black people? Whether he did or not, or she did or not. Even the inquiry comes from a position of being in the center.
And being used to being in the center.
And being used to being in the center.
Returning to women's literature in the 20th century, stylistically, there is a huge diversity. While some authors like Margaret Drabble prefers the traditional forms of realism, others like the Irish poet Edna O'Brien continue the modernist line that reflects the fragmented complexity of mental processes. On the other hand, women writers from the Commonwealth countries and those belonging to racial, ethnic, or lesbian subcultures began to modify the literary and linguistic conventions of the English canon. For instance, the Anglo-Indian poet Kamala Das develops a style that expresses the peculiar Indian vision. Ama Ato Haido from Ghana, a novelist and playwright, incorporates the rhythms of African variants of English into her novels. Jamaica Kincaid does the same with the Caribbean. But in addition, from between the 1990s and 80s and 90s, the tradition of female discourse in English-speaking world has echoed formal experimentation that dissolves the boundaries between genres and styles. The poetic sequences derive in prose fragments, and the narration slips between fiction and autobiography, as in Angela Carter's stories, and also between children's stories and the Gothic. Thematically, women's literature is also diversified between the parameters of self-definition and social criticism. Those who take self as the theme, they explore their professions, motherhood, sexual and economic freedom, and so on. For example, Anais Nin strives to articulate her personal definition of woman from a new experience of sexuality and creativity. Muriel Spark, or Antonia Susan Duffy, also known as A.S. Byatt, writes from the awareness of their situation as women and capture the conflict between art and life, duty and self-realization. Focusing on the theme of society, real or imaginary, women writers construct a sociological analysis of the relationship between women and their communities. They emphasize a definition of personal experience that is totally separated from the social performance. For example, Doris Lessing and Nadine Gordimer. In the United States and Canada, the feminist boom of the late 1960s brought a renewed interest in women's discourse. As in Great Britain, its experience as a radical diversification. The incorporation of Chicano, African American, and Asian American literature broadens the sense of cultural multiplicity and calls for a profound revision of the concept of the American nation and tradition, while homosexual literature increases the complexity of generic considerations. Writers from different subcultures interweave gender, sex, class, race, ethnicity, religion in the revisions of the literary tradition. Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison, Alice Walker reconstruct African American history and offer new perspective on the Black woman. Amy Tang voices the Asian American woman. Louise Erdrich includes the Amerindian. Erika Young explores Jewish culture in North America. Joyce Carol Oates, Alison Lurie, Grace Paley, Gail Godwin, among others, review the concept of white women from different social and geographical aspects. Stylistically, the texts interweave poetic and mythical configurations with more realistic narration, and disparate genres are explored, from the realistic utopia of life by Marge Piercy to the dystopian settings of The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood or The Good Mother by Sue Miller. The third wave of the 1990s benefited from the preceding ones, but rejected the universal white sisterhood that excluded race and sexual orientation, LGBTQ, and trans women. This wave started to look for the past and present models of women's intellectual power as well as beauty, a concept of beauty that included all differences and did not discriminate. Pop stars like Madonna, the Spice Girls preached girl power in platform shoes and conical bras. The great issues for women at this time were eating disorders, such as anorexia and bulimia, that plagued many women who struggled to keep thin in order to fit in what was culturally accepted to be the correct body size. The biological distinction between man and woman eventually came under the scrutiny of theorists. The example of body size is just one among many examples that show that sexual differences circulate in cultural practices. In other words, it is performative discourse, to use Judith Butler's term. Butler was born in 1956 in a family of Hungarian, Jewish, and Russian Jewish descent. She studied at Yale University and had a Fulbright at Heidelberg in 1985. After her PhD, she taught at Wesleyan University, George Washington University, and Johns Hopkins University before joining the University of California, Berkeley in 1993. Initially, Butler viewed the category of gender as a human construct enacted by a vast repetition of social performance. In her essay, Performative Acts and Gender Constitution from 1988, Butler proposes that gender is performance. She draws on the phenomenology of Maurice Merleau-Ponty and the feminism of Simone de Beauvoir, noting that both thinkers ground their theories in lived experience and view the sexual body as a historical idea or situation. But Butler distinguishes between sex as a biological facticity and gender as the cultural interpretation or signification of that facticity. And this is a quote. According to Butler's theory, gender is essentially a performative repetition of acts associated with male or female. Butler argues that the performance of gender itself creates gender. Additionally, she compares the performativity of gender to the performance of theater. She developed her theory further in Gender Trouble in 1990, postulating that performativity of gender alludes to 1974 John Waters film Female Trouble, which starts with the drag queen Divine. The book discusses the works of Freud, de Beauvoir, Kristeva, Lacan, Lucy de Garay, Monique Wittig, Jacques Derrida, and Michel Foucault. Butler argued that it is not enough to affirm that gender is constructed, because this would suggest that it is constructed from something, that is, that cultural difference is subsequently to biological change. So Butler explains that gender is not an attribute, something that one has or is, but a process that constitutes the same thing that it says to define. So, expanding Foucault's ideas, Butler affirms that gender is not a cause of discourse, but an effect of discourse. Her volume, Bodies That Matter, on the discursive limits of sex, from 1993, sought to clear up readings and misreadings on the notion of performativity. Butler also emphasized the role of repetition in performativity, making use of Derrida's theory of iterability. According to Butler, the performance of gender is not voluntary, She believes the gender, sex, desire, and subject must be constructed within what she calls, borrowing Foucault's discipline and punish, regulative discourses. She understands the sex-gender distinction as a feminist strategy for contesting constructions of binary, asymmetric gender and compulsory heterosexuality. She believes that feminists should focus on providing an account of how power functions and shapes our understandings of womanhood, not only in the society at large, but also within the feminist movement.
It's one thing to say that gender is performed, and that's a little different from saying gender is performative. When we say gender is performed, we usually mean that we've taken on a role, we're acting in some way, and that our acting or our role playing is crucial to the gender that we are and the gender that we present to the world. To say that gender is performative is a little different, because for something to be performative means that it produces a series of effects. We act and walk and speak and talk in ways that consolidate an impression of being a man or being a woman. You know, I was walking down the street in Berkeley when I first arrived several years ago, and a young woman who was, I think, in high school leaned out of her window and she yelled, "Are you a lesbian?" And she was looking to harass me. Or maybe she was just freaked out, or she thought I looked like I probably was one and wanted to know. But instead I just turned around and I said, "Yes, I am." And that really shocked her. We act as if that being of a man or that being of a woman is actually an internal reality or something that's simply true about us, a fact about us. Actually, it's a phenomenon that's being produced all the time and reproduced all the time. So to say gender is performative is to say that nobody really is a gender from the start. I know it's controversial, but that's my claim. Think about how difficult it is for sissy boys, or how difficult it is for tomboys to function socially without being bullied, or without being teased, or without sometimes suffering threats of violence. Or without their parents intervening to say, maybe you need a psychiatrist, or why can't you be normal? So, you know, there are institutional powers like psychiatric normalization, and there are informal kinds of practices like bullying, which try to keep us in our gendered place. There's a real question for me about how such gender norms get established and policed, and what the best way is to disrupt them and to overcome the police function. It's my view that gender is culturally formed, but it's also a domain of agency or freedom. It's most important to resist the violence that is imposed by ideal gender norms, especially against those who are gender different, who are non-conforming in their gender presentation. What interests me, perhaps here, as a point of contact, might be precisely the understanding that what we call the I, and what we seem to sometimes, under contemporary conditions of individualism, what we sometimes understand as the seat or source of action, is itself comes out of something that is more vast and more relational, and it also dissolves back into it, not just with coming into life and passing from life, although certainly there, but also within life, as what might even be understood to be a recurrent kind of process. And that does mean taking a perspective on the I, the sovereign I, from somewhere else that does not presume that I as a pure center of control or mastery.
Although Butler is a philosopher, she has established herself as one of the most important theorists of interdisciplinary cultural studies, involving the perspective of queer. Much of Butler's early political activism centered around queer and feminist issues, and she served for a period as the chair of the board of the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission. Her work is mainly devoted to elucidating how the body and its desires are socially regulated and how, in turn, resistance to this normalization can be exerted. This question, for example, is formulated in her book from 1997, Psychic Mechanisms of Power, Theories on Subjection, in the following terms, and I quote, "How does power establish subjectivity that later subdues, in turn resists it? Based on the ambivalence of the English signifier subjection, Butler proposes that power brings subjectivity to the fore in a paradoxical movement, since power is not only that to which we are opposed, but on what we depend. Therefore, she maintains that the trope of power is its ability to turn it against itself, since it produces the subject in subjection and the subject in rebellion. Discourse also divides the subject, at least in the sense that the account of subjection is inevitably circular, she says, and I quote, since it presupposes the very subject of which it purports to account. Faced with this paradox, Butler asks a question of political scope. That is, and I quote again, how can the subject empower herself against the same power that found him? How to adopt an attitude of opposition to power, even while recognizing that all opposition is committed by the same power that you oppose. Butler is currently an executive member of the Educational Network for Human Rights in Israel-Palestine.
If we look at the development of the gay, lesbian, bi, trans movement in the United States, the more cultural acceptance, the more cultural discourse, the more media presentation, the more proximity that people have to gay, lesbian, bi, trans people, the more that life becomes thinkable. It becomes a cultural possibility that one can consider because it's already in the world. You could say that the discourse of homosexuality, as it becomes more popular, makes it more possible for people to become gay or lesbian. My sense is that there's always something about desire and fantasy that's maybe partially unconscious or not fully realizable. Although certain kinds of cultural movements might make it possible to lead a lesbian or gay life, they don't determine that. They don't produce homosexuals.
In the 1990s, queer theory came in full force amid studies on subjectivity and gender that questioned Western ideas on sexual identity, viewing sexuality as a complex array of social codes and forces, individual activity, and institutional power. It also challenged heterosexism, homophobia, in addition to racism, misogyny, and other oppressive discourses while celebrating diversity. Queer theory encouraged the examination of the world from an alternative view, unmasking signs of homosexuality in all literature and revealing negative constructs of homosexual identities. Queer theory questions the fixed categories of sexual identity and the cognitive mechanisms and paradigms generated by normative and what is considered normal sexual ideology. To queer becomes an act by which stable boundaries of sexual identity are transgressed, reversed, and mimicked. Foucault's work on sexuality anticipates and informs the queer theoretical movement. Judy Butler's contends that heterosexual identity, long held to be a normative ground of sexuality, is actually produced by the suppression of homoerotic possibility. Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, with her book Epistemology of the Closet, published in 1990, is another pioneer theorist of queer theory. For Sedgwick, the standard histories of Western societies are presented in terms of heterosexual identity concerning inheritance, marriage, dynasty, family, domesticity, population, and homosexual identity within this framework is already problematic. Writers like Shirley Jackson or Jeanette Winterson have published novels that celebrate queering visions. Winterson's novel Sex in the Cherry from 1989 deconstructs the binary oppositions of history and fiction, male and female, not by reversing the hierarchies, but by blending them in such a way as to show their relational and differential processes. The novel takes place in the 17th century London, where the fabulous dog woman makes a living by organizing fights and races for her hounds. But the date of the text is not fixed in the sense of closure, because Winterson challenges fixed ideas of history by creating an aura of ambiguity and uncertainty in her reference to the historical events. The dog woman's foster son, Jordan, narrates half the novel, and his sections alternate with those of his mother. The text subverts the dominant male vision as the only viable vision of reality and displaces male perception as the only perception with universal parameters. These recent narrative fictions resist ideological and linguistic impositions, and the notion of all-powerful author is totally demystified. In this respect, feminist literary criticism has not only achieved a revision of the literary canon, but also emerged as one of the most challenging critical theories in rethinking of all literary conventions. Similarly, the work of lesbian feminist black poets like Grace Nichols, it's always politically charged, deconstructing the oppressor's language, not only with anger, but with humor, as in Nichols' poem, Fat Black Woman in Bubble Bath. And you have the quotation of the poem on your screen. Oh, how I long to place my foot on the head of anthropology, to sweep my breast in the face of history, to scrub my back with the dogma of theology, to put my soap in the slimming industries. Prophet Soames spoke. Stop East Coast sky, stop deep Coast sky, waves, me. As those women writers of narrative fiction and short stories, lesbian women poets were concerned with the opposition between biology and creativity. The myth of the poet as divine visionary was transformed by a feminized language of bodily experience. Adrienne Rich, for example, has claimed the voice of the lesbian woman. In her poem Power, she articulates the relationship between heroism and victimization. Here, the heroine is scientist Marie Curie, and the radiant energies at the heart of creation are revised and transformed into nuclear power, the burning within into radiation sickness. The effect of this intertextual transformation is not to write the heroine into a Faustian fable of the price of knowledge, but to question the myth of transcendence which divorces the visionary mind from the suffering material body, showing the extent to which it rests on denial.
This is called Power. Living in the earth deposits of our history. Today, a backhoe divulged out of a crumbling flank of earth. One bottle, amber, perfect, 100-year-old cure for fever or melancholy, a tonic for living on this earth in the winters of this climate. Today I was reading about Marie Curie. She must have known she suffered from radiation sickness, her body bombarded for years by the element she had purified. It seems she denied to the end the source of the cataracts on her eyes, the cracked and suppurating skin of her finger ends, till she could no longer hold a test tube or a pencil. She died, a famous woman, denying her wounds came from the same source as her power.
On your screen, there are several quotations from Rich's Compulsory Heterosexuality and Lesbian Existence, an article published in Science in 1980. And let's read some of it. I'm suggesting that heterosexuality, like motherhood, needs to be recognized and studied as a political institution, even or especially by those individuals who feel they are, in their personal experience, the precursors of a new social relation between the sexes. It becomes inescapable question whether the issue we have to address as feminists is not simply gender inequality, nor the domination of culture by males, nor mere taboos against homosexuality, but the enforcement of heterosexuality for women as a means of assuring male right of physical, economical, and emotional access. Finally, the assumption that most women are innately heterosexual stands as a theoretical and political stumbling block for many women, partly because to acknowledge that for women heterosexuality may not be a preference at all, but something that has had to be imposed, managed, organized, propagandized, and maintained by force, is an immediate step to take if you consider yourself freely and innately heterosexual.
I think if you tell the story of your vagina, you tell the story of your life in some fundamental way. Most of my childhood was determined and structured and created by violence. My father was very, very angry, raging person. My father's violence and his sexual abuse really eroded my esteem in a very profound way and made me feel stupid and made me feel worthless and made me feel that I didn't have a right to be here. But it also made me, I see now, incredibly tuned in to other people's suffering. I had no intention of writing a play about vaginas, to be perfectly honest with you. I was already a way downtown playwright, and that would have assured my status there forever. But I was talking to a woman, and she was talking about menopause, and she got onto the subject of her vagina, and just was saying that it was dried up and finished and dead and horrible. And I was like, wow, I can't believe she feels that way about her vagina. And so I just said, well, what do women think about their vagina? I have no idea. So I would just say to a friend casually, well, do you like your vagina? And you know, first woman said to me, my mother used to tell me, don't wear panties underneath your pajamas, you need to air out your pussycat. And I thought, oh my God, maybe I should do something with this piece.
Women love to talk about their vaginas. They do. Mainly because no one's ever asked them before.
From the minute I started performing it, it was just one of those amazing things. People just responded. The play really started to take off in all different forms. It was shocking to me. I have to tell you, it's still shocking to me.
Respect this vagina.
I started to realize that the play could be a tool for breaking taboos, for getting dialogue going. We then created this idea of V-Day, Vagina Day, Victory Day, Valentine's Day. We were thinking we'd do one performance in New York City to raise money for local groups working to stop domestic violence. That event ended up to be the most extraordinary evening where 2,500 people came and all these fabulous actors from Glenn Close to Susan Sarandon to Lily Tomlin to Rosie Perez.
My vagina is angry. It is. It's pissed off. My vagina is furious and it needs to talk.
The kind of violence and the kind of degradation that goes on to women, and the kind of potential for pleasure and for power and for enjoyment that exists in the vagina, both. It just struck a chord for whatever reason, and it continues to, 14 years later.
Fourth wave feminism, it's a phase of feminism that began around 2010 and is characterized by a focus on empowerment of women and the use of internet tools such as #activism. In the next video of this series, I will talk about this wave as well as feminist approaches to visual studies, ecofeminism, and cyberfeminism. So thank you for listening.